other environmental. So also, this masterclass really hopes to look at the urgency of how we can use the social enterprise model to address the urgency of the environmental crisis and climate change. So hopefully, you will have a very good session today with Mr. Rafid. And hopefully, if you have questions, oh, I see Mr. Rafid is here with us today. So hello, good morning, Mr. Rafid.
Hello.
Do you need help with your presentation or um? Okay, wait.
I think I can share it with my screen,
Wait.
if that's okay. Yeah. Can I start now, or
Ah,
you
yes, go
still
ahead, Mr.
waiting
Rafid.
for? Okay. All right. Thank you, Angelo. Hi, everyone. Good morning from Jakarta. Thank you very much for the ASEAN Foundation and SEDP program for inviting me to share about the learning experiences that we have. So my name is Rafid Shidqi. Right now, I'm working with the ASEAN Development Bank Youth for Asia. So I'm currently leading the project called the Atoll Youth Climate Project. So it's more on the project focusing on resolving climate crisis and how we empower the youth communities in the Asia Pacific, especially in the Atoll countries. And it's on the Pacific, but I think some of the case studies and also the issues is quite relevant. And I will share you two different case studies on how we can, engaging youth communities in contributing to solving climate and environmental issues. So this is the presentation outline that we'll be providing. So I will give a brief information about myself, and then I will give two different case studies. The first one is the current Asian Development Bank Youth for Asia project, which is Atoll Youth Climate Project. And the second one is that the Treasure Shack Indonesia, which is the nonprofit that I've been leading and managing in Indonesia. We're focusing on developing the capacity of youth communities within the Coral Triangle region, more specifically on the eastern side of Indonesia. It's a kind of a remote and archipelagic region where we've seen more and more climate impacts in the area. And then I will share a little bit. I'm very sorry if there's like not very strong social enterprise aspect, but we'll kind of like, sharing what is the approach that we learn, especially on the process of design and also on the implementations in order for you to kind of like, engage and create an effective impact on these environmental issues. So the first one that I will share about the learning points is that the multi-dimensions of climate change, which we often overlook. The second one is do not bring the solutions before you kind of consider several points that are very important based on my field experiences. And then the fourth one is building networks of stakeholders. And the last one is the policy integration. So it's a little bit about myself. So I just graduated from the University of California at Santa Cruz in the US. So I'm actually a marine conservation by training. My background is more on the environmental science and also marine conservation in specific. And then when I got into Asian Development Bank, I started to focus more on learning and working on the climate change issues, especially on the small island developing states. And from 2018 until present, I'm actually working with the Treasure Shack Indonesia, which I was initiated in 2018 as kind of like youth-led organizations that trying to focus on protecting livelihoods of the coastal communities. And we're slowly expanding towards solving a broader environmental issues. So for example, on the climate impacts and also environmental rehabilitations, and helping the local fishermen to actually improve their livelihoods and stop targeting endangered species. And from 2016 until 2021, I've been working as a youth consultant in various issues and organizations, especially on marine conservation, more specific, endangered species protections, youth capacity development, and also sustainable fisheries with organizations like the United Nations Development Program and also the Sustainable Ocean Alliance based in the US. So let me share the first case study, which is the project that we are currently developing in the Asian Development Bank. So we have the project that is funded by the Irish Climate Resilience Fund by the Ireland government. So the project titled is Catalyzing Youth-Led Climate Actions in the Atoll Nations. So this is more outside of the Southeast Asia context, but I feel like for countries like Indonesia or the Philippines, there are kind of like island countries and archipelago. We've seen kind of like the same experiences related to the climate. For example, like more frequent disasters, food security issues, failed crops, and that impacting livelihoods and also well-being of the coastal communities. So in the catalyzing youth-led climate actions in the Atoll Nations, we're focusing on 4 countries. So the Kiribati, Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, and also the Maldives. So these 4 countries are projected to be drowned because of the sea level rise. So it's been a very emergency situations for the communities because they are low-lying countries. They've only have the height a few meters below the sea level, and then they've experienced so many excessive climate impacts. So for example, the frequent storms and typhoon and cyclones, and also some of the social issues. So for example, health impacts, and also the livelihoods and in the job sectors and markets. However, the atoll nations, especially the communities in the Pacific, they are they feel they are in the front line of like the climate impacts, but they're actually contributing the least on the greenhouse gas emissions. However, in the process of the policymaking and also how the government and how the community responds to the climate change, often excluding the role of youth, there's still kind of like a traditional approach on that one, because I think that feel relevant to some communities in Indonesia as well, that older communities are put in the leadership position, and then the younger generations are being neglected on that process. So I think that this is very important when you, especially if you are coming, if you are wanted to develop a social enterprise or even a non-profit organizations that that is located outside of your home region or home countries, you have to be aware on that kind of cultural sensitivity, so that your interventions could still match with the local realities, and it could kind of like penetrate towards the right directions. And through the project itself, we have the question. So the small island developing states, especially in the atoll nations, they've been facing this climate crisis, and then they've been hit by multiple different issues on this climate itself. And then the questions is like, how can we catalyze the youth-led actions to solve the climate issues itself, right? And there are like several approaches that we do in the ADB Youth for Asia. The project is currently still ongoing in the beginning process, but hopefully this could serve as a good case study for you. So we are using an approach called the meaningful youth engagement. What is actually the meaningful youth engagement? So it's basically creating and nurturing an accommodative environment for youth to be involved in the whole process of the project management cycle or even the social enterprise cycle. This is what we do. And then, so basically the youth representative actively participates in the design of the process, in the implementations, and also in the impact measurement, which then will give the youth direct experience to know, just like this ASEAN SEDP, like, if you would like to engage, especially your local youth in your community to be involved in the, climate activities, you will need to be, to engage them since the start of the process, and then actually asking them to, in the process of the design implementation and also the impact measurement. So in regards of the meaningful youth engagement, there are like 3 approach that Asian Development Bank Youth for Asia is currently working on. The first one is the youth-led climate risk assessment in the project. So this is actually the first process of how we are going to implement the project. So why the youth-led climate assessment is important? Because I think first, the climate issues is very complex. And then sometimes like when we would like to build a social enterprise, we kind of go into the directions, oh, these social enterprise are creating an approach that is related to climate mitigations, for example, like rehabilitating mangroves or like rehabilitating the coastal environment. And then we directly like build the solutions around that approach. So I think that, it may be a good approach, but I think it's not gonna be all relevant to the whole of the climate crisis situations that we have. And then the one thing that we would like to do is that we would like to understand more on the youth perspective, because we're focusing on the youth-led climate actions, to participate in the research and data gathering at first before we developing any kind of potential interventions. So the first one, we ask the youth coming from the countries or from the communities to do and formulate questions around what is the specific climate issues impacting the youth. There's, several countries have already conducted the climate risk assessment, but the youth role or the youth perceptions related to climate impacts towards themselves is still being kind of like excluded in that process. So all of the climate reports mostly integrating all of the technical sites. So for example, like the temperature rise, sea level rise, the cyclones and stuff like that. But we don't know like what are those physical climate impacts towards the youth community. So we like to target the vulnerable youth population. So this is also another important point, is that like there are so many spectrums of the youth populations, especially the vulnerable youth groups. So for example, those who are migrated from their home countries, and then children and women, and also youth with disabilities, youth with limited health access. So you want to make sure that all of those vulnerable youth categories are included in your approach. So you could capture the specific needs that they may have in your next interventions. The second one is that once we understand all of those issues through the data gathering and analysis, we ask the youth to then think through on the systems. Okay, we have these different issues, for example, around health or around livelihoods or around food security, and then we ask the youth to think like, what are the potential solutions that you could work on at the local level with potentially low cost, and then you could solve that issues on your own community, and then you can scale it up into different communities within the country or outside the countries. And the last one is that once the youth have already come up with the design and implementations, it is very important to then invite the adult partners, especially the governments. So sometimes I think there is still a barrier where you develop a social enterprise model, or even like the interventions, you're not necessarily, especially when you work on the local level, you're not necessarily integrated with the current government policies, which I think that in some point, based on my experience, that the local government policies may have the capacity to actually sustain your initiative or your approach into the long term. So for example, they could include the annual development budget, or like any the funding mechanisms that the government may have, which potentially more sustainable in the future. I'm speaking on the lens of the nonprofit, but I think that you could explore this opportunity on how to integrating the policy and dialogue within the government and also other stakeholders. So the thing that we learned through the initial scoping of the Atoll Youth Camp projects, we've started to see existing solutions that are present within the youth communities in the Atoll Nation. So for example, there are climate impacts that in so many different spectrums and levels. So for example, like they've experienced drought, and then they have water scarcity, and then they have non-communicable disease because of so for example, like obesity, because they lack of food resources within the island, so they can only consume the foods that is unhealthy, and then it turns out it creates it makes them gain weight, weight and then the gain weight, cholesterol and something like that. So it's actually like, although not directly impacting by the climate crisis, but it's kind of like one aspect that you have to think through. And then the more frequent disasters, and there are some communities that are located in the outer islands, but they not respond fast because there is no available fast forward communications platform because of the inaccessibility of the internet or even like the technology. So if you would like to kind of like create the solutions that are integrating technology, you have to also kind of see into that local realities. And then we've surfaced like one potential solutions that youth have developed, which is for example, the youth in Marshall Islands here, the students at Marshall Islands, they are developing a low-cost solar power desalinator. So they actually get some seawater from the ocean and then they put into this chamber, which will then put under the strong sunlight, and that this process will kind of like create a fresh water that is drinkable for the island community. So this is kind of like a small pilot projects that have been developed, and I think that it is very important to see these local solutions that have already worked, but they are looking for ways how they could scale it up or like maybe monetize it to different communities in the island or even in other countries. So I think there's kind of like the social entrepreneurship aspects that could be taught by the youth communities at the Marshall Islands to give them the capacity in enlarging their climate solutions. And that's the case study from the Atoll Youth Climate Project, how the climate have already impacted and the approach that we do to kind of like surfacing that local solutions and actually start to integrate, little types of capacity building activities that might be useful for them. And the second one is that the project that I co-lead with my team, it's called the Indigenous Champion Project, which is located in the Alor Archipelago in Indonesia, in East Nusa Tenggara provinces. So it's a small island communities. Right now, the communities, especially during the monsoon season, they've experienced worse, physical impacts. So, for example, the homes are being hit by storms. That's due because of the several coastal barriers have already destroyed. So, for example, the mangrove and coastal vegetation. So they don't have kind of like barriers to protect them from any climate-related disasters. And this is like this is an ongoing problem, but we don't have really that much youth involvement in the process. And then from our perspective, like we would like to give the youth the platform. How can we reduce the community's risk to coastal hazard and build long-term resilience through the youth leadership itself? And we kind of like use the same methodology that IDBYFA is doing, which is the meaningful youth engagement. So we provide the services by giving the capacity building for the young communities, and also the financial supports for them to be able to develop the climate solutions on their own. So the first one, we provide an intensive 2 weeks capacity buildings. Initially, before we come, there's some kind of like a uniform way of thinking that the youth, okay, we have these issues, and then the solution should be like socializations or increasing awareness, or like, something that is like, don't have a direct impact solutions to, and it's not very effective to kind of like create a system change. So as we ask the youth to kind of like think through the system. So basically we ask them to, asking the why. So, okay, the coastal areas are being degraded, why? And then, for example, in one case, that there is one community that actually harvesting mangrove forests, and also they're harvesting the sand around the coastal areas for building homes. And the communities are not really aware on the impacts of that one. And then the youth are, the youth already aware, okay, the communities are harvesting the mangroves and also harvesting the sands. Why are they doing it? They're building home. Why are they building home? And it's really related to the poverty, because there's inaccessibility of incentives or inaccessibility of funding that's needed for these communities to build on their own homes. And finally, like the youth started to understand the root causes of the climate impacts that is circular around the community empowerment and also the accessibility of finance or incentives for the coastal communities to build on their homes. And then based on that understanding, we asked the youth to design what kind of intervention it is needed for these communities to, increase their resilience and reduce the risk to the future climate hazards. And then the next one is that we connect them with the, with the private donors and also with different parts of private sectors. So for example, like the dive operators that are living within the island, they have kind of like, a social development funding, and then they could contribute to that, co-develop with the youth and funding their solutions in this aspect. And then we also provide the youth with the ability, the communications ability, the pitching experience, and then how to develop the grant proposals or even the business model to the that could be proposed to the private entities within the island. So it's still kind of like a very small scale experience. And then this one example that the youth projects have come out, the youth climate project is the stopping coastal sand mining and increasing the resilience. So the youth have already understand the root causes of why the climate impacts is worsening, why during the monsoon there's like more and more homes being destroyed. They understand the drive that the communities are mining the sands for building houses. And it was the motivations behind it was because the communities simply do not have any money to buy the sand from the outside, or they don't have any incentives. And then therefore, like they working together with the local government, especially at the village level, to start utilizing the local funding that they have within the village and provide the incentives for the local communities to do sand mining. So for example, for the communities who are needed these many sacks of sand, they could be given kind of like incentives towards that, and they have to like stop the coastal sand mining. In turn, the communities will be engaged in the process of the rehabilitation process. So for example, like revegetating the mangroves and also revegetating the coastal vegetations around the areas to increase the future resilience, and in part of the monitoring process of how to ensure that, for example, the mangroves that they've planted is not being destroyed or being like picked up or like being destroyed by a dog or something like that. So that communities will in turn be kind of like provide services to the environment. And also the youth are building awareness on the importance of the, protecting the coastal ecosystems and also the vegetations that are present there to ensure that they are not, getting back to harvesting mangroves and also harvesting the sand ecosystems there. And I think that there's all of the experience that we have, in terms of when we would like to develop a solutions related to the climate change, we have to be aware that the climate change is a multidimensional issues. So essentially, like it could, impact other SDG aspects. So for example, poverty, water security and sanitations, education. So because when, for example, storms are hitting one village, it could kind of like shut down all of the activities within the islands itself. So children will not have educations, children will not have, or maybe like the communities will not have any drinkable water, or like, being affected by disease. And these solutions are actually kind of absent in terms of youth-led climate innovations. So, yes, building an enterprise around mitigations is important, but I genuinely believe, like personally believe, that adaptations touching all of these aspects related to the climate issues will be important. So for example, how we can develop a social enterprise that can solve the issues on water, for example, to increase the access of drinking waters for the communities who are on the front line or the high risk of the climate. And another one may be providing kind of like health access to the communities who don't have any health insurance and something like that. So we can capture like the social enterprise aspect by understanding all of these interconnected issues around the climate change, not only rebuilding the vegetations, but also paying attention to the social cause that it has caused by the climate change itself. And then importantly, I think before we wanted to develop the climate solutions, especially for someone who are actually, coming from the outside of the island or coming from the outside of the area, do not directly bring the solutions to the local communities. So before you start developing the solutions, I think it is very important to start dialogue and empathy with them. So it's actually part of the process that we do with the IDBYFA and also with my own projects in Indonesia, is that we started to start a dialogue with the communities, with the youth communities, and then we listen with empathy. And then by then we kind of like know what is their concern, what is they need. And we have to also respect the traditional values. So, maybe there are some aspects that we have to be very careful, especially in regards to leadership or how we can nurture like youth leadership. Traditional values, like for example, in the island communities where elders have more authority rather than the youth. And we're not saying it's a bad thing, but I think we have to kind of like, navigate around that, and how our interventions, especially on the climate innovations, will be effective as possible. And then third thing is build capacity and understanding. So it's not all of the people understand about the climate change or like the climate impacts or like environmental conservation and preservation. So it is very important to include the capacity building activities in your social enterprise if you're wanted to kind of like sustain the long-term awareness and involvement and participations, especially on the vulnerable youth communities. And you have to provide resources. So they have already the capacity and the idea of how to solve the issue and the involvement. But at least you could provide the resources. So for example, the networks through your enterprise, or the funding that you have, or maybe connected, or connected the youth who already have the projects to the body that actually have the financial access to it. So it could be part of the surface. And also you have to provide friends and role models. So I think that youth are still seeking the character or charisma of someone in order for them to kind of like sustain their motivations, and also enlarge the drive, and sometimes like working in environmental issues is very kind of like depressing in some ways because the issues is too large. But we have to present the youth with the people with like-minded communities, and also the role model that they can look up to, so they can increase their impact and maintain their spirit on solving these issues. And this is also the last thing that I've always keep in my mind, is that okay, we would like to build a project, or like we would like to build the social enterprise, and then we would like to work on a certain communities, maybe in island communities or remote communities, communities with poverty, something like that. For most of us, maybe for me, like it may be just an exciting project, but if you come into the community or indigenous community, it's actually their lives that you're trying to change. So be very mindful on trying to create the projects that may create a certain impacts, whether it's positive or adverse, into that one. So that's why I think it's very important to integrate like local knowledge and building understanding and listen with empathy before you kind of like proposing a solution, so proposing an idea to these local communities. And lastly, I think build network with stakeholders. Like what I said, is that youth adult partnerships with the government, giving them the role models and provide kind of like advices for them to maintain their motivations, and build relationship with the entities to like kind of a surface where the finance could be an issue for the youth-led communities. So how can the youth access that funding through the private entities, especially within their local businesses and something like that. And the last one is the policy integration. So it is very important to document all of your learning experience, especially in developing this youth-led project into knowledge, and then work together with the local government to integrate how your social enterprise impacts, for example, or like the service that you've provided have already match with the local policies and realities, and that's potentially can sustain that from local financing mechanisms. Yeah, so that's all. I hope all of my presentations make sense and useful. I will be very happy to answer any questions if there's any.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rafid, for your very interesting and very informative presentation. I'm actually taking a global governance class today, and it's very interesting to see how the theories that we learned about actually translate to real practices in what you've shared today. So we have one question from Baslin Fadila. Baslin is asking, how do you engage with local communities, and usually how long is the process to gain the trust of the community?
Yeah, thanks very much, Baslin. I think this is a very important first step before you decide to, build social enterprise or projects around the local communities. I think the trust is the first thing that you would like to build. Like what I say, I think based on my experiences that we have to experience, live among them. So I spent almost 1 year to actually live within the communities, living in one of the local houses, helping them kind of like, cleaning their chicken farms and then attending weddings, and, attending kind of like local celebrations, something like that. And that's one way to kind of like, make the communities understand that you're part of them. And then start from that, they can be a little bit more open in voicing their issues or kind of like challenges that they've been facing, rather than when you're, for example, like you're from the capital and then you're coming from a small to the small island, and then you would like to create, like, for example, a business model for the youth communities or for the communities themselves. And then I think it will be very challenging one before you gain their trust and also understanding. And especially I think that, you have to surface all of that hidden informations that they may keep before they trust you. So yeah, I think that one way. And I think the time on building that trust itself will be vary depending on the characteristic of the communities themselves. If you're from Indonesia, I think that if you're working for the coastal communities, there may be a common understanding that people in the coastal communities have a slightly stronger character. Like, you cannot, like, for example, you cannot tell them to do something because that's not how they respond to that kind of communication. So yeah, it is very important to understand the character of the local communities itself, and before you and that way I think you can start to develop a communication strategy on how to better engage them in the initiative. I hope that's the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Rafid. We have another question from Priscilla. She is asking, especially as you shared a while ago, that the climate crisis and the climate change is a multidimensional, multifaceted issue, something like a wicked problem. So Priscilla is asking, how do we tackle multidimensional problems in the form of public education?
Yeah, thanks, Priscilla. I think, yeah, like the climate change is very multidimensional, and in terms of public educations, it can be very context specific. So, for example, in the island communities, not all of the people have the same perceptions about the climate change, especially maybe the older generations, or maybe slightly the younger generation. Sometimes they thought like, oh, climate change, is it like the change of rainfall, or like, a worse, kind of a different pattern of rainfall and something like that. And it might be like, a very different perceptions. And I think first it's because there are inaccessibility to the informations. And when you want to build that kind of understanding related to climate change, I think first you have to, like understand how is the level of awareness of the people in there, and then whether or not the climate education is needed for the community. So, as simple as building the awareness, as simple as building understanding among the elementary school students, for example. So you're building the curriculum and how the basic understanding about climate change would greatly impact their perceptions in the future when they grow older. So I think that especially sometimes, like, climate change is very invisible, that the coastal communities may see that it's something that is, oh, it's just kind of like a common thing when we have this uh, different pattern of rainfall. It's just happen every other year or something like that, but they don't really aware, because I don't think we built that understanding at first. So when you would like to engage that in the public educations, you have to ensure that the climate educations is included. Yeah, I hope that answers. I think that we have time up. Is it?
Yeah, I think we will be closing the room in a while. But thank you so much, Mr. Rafid, for your
Thank you.
very informative presentation and for your answers to those questions. I have one question. Right, you're currently working in ADB. Are you in the Philippines right now?
No, I'm in Indonesia.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I was
still
just curious
pandemic.
because isn't the headquarters yeah,
Yeah,
somewhere here?
yeah,
All right,
yeah.
thank you so much again, Mr. Fid. So
Thank you. You're welcome.
everyone, I think we will be going back to the main room in a while. So thank you for listening and thank you for fielding those questions.